trigger warning for my section for suicidality, depression, isolation, and incarceration, of course. Hey, I'm going to be hopping around a couple different topics because, as Gabe said, the prison industrial system is incredibly insidious, and its rotten roots just has its fingers into everything. Sorry to mix my metaphors. Um, there is something uniquely American about the United States' high rate of incarceration and low access to healthcare, including mental health care. The US leads the world in incarceration rates with 5% of our population behind bars and hosts the largest number of incarcerated individuals. The US both has the highest incarceration rates and the highest of broad numbers incarcerated. We have about 2.2 million people incarcerated as of last year in this country.
That's so
As I
gross.
said, it's gross. It's not cute. As I said before, Philadelphia boasts the highest per capita incarceration rate of the 10 largest US cities. I'm going to be going more in detail about the incarcerated Philadelphia population. But first, I'm going to start off a little bit more macro, and then we're going to get more detailed.
Awesome.
Research shows, in fact, it's been really well established that incarcerated populations are much more likely to have chronic physical and mental health conditions, as well as poorer health outcomes that last far, far beyond their release from prison. Too often, the prison industrial complex serves as one of the primary providers of mental health system in our society, which may not be so awful if jails and prisons were even remotely designed to be able to manage these
Yeah.
challenges, but they're not. And when we look at the research, we actually see the opposite. In fact, for each year a person stays in prison, it takes 2 years off of that individual's life expectancy.
Oh, wow.
One study compared a life expectancy of the US against other high income democracies and found that from 1891 to 2007, US life expectancy would have increased by more than 5 years if it had not been for mass incarceration.
That's
That
insane.
is the gravity that we are looking at.
Wow.
And these countless studies support the hypothesis that high recidivism rates, meaning that when people go continually get arrested and sent back to jail and prison, it reflects a unmet mental health needs and services of individuals and communities. So I'm going to list off some facts just in case you weren't depressed enough.
Yeah.
The majority of these facts come from NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, as well as prisonpolicies.org. So nationally in this country, about 2 in 5 people currently incarcerated have a history of mental illness, which is twice the rate as the average in this country. 1 in 4 people with what's called a serious mental illness or severe mental illness have been arrested in their lifetime, leading to over 200 million jail bookings of people with psychiatric disabilities every year.
Mm.
And even in a juvenile justice system, 7 out of 10 youths, minors, are experiencing a mental health condition. 1 in 4 murders by police of civilians between 2015 and 2020 involved a mental health condition. 1 in 4 people with a serious mental psychological distress are in jails. 66% of people incarcerated in federal prisons report not receiving any mental health care while incarcerated. And that number goes up to 74% in state prisons. So that leaves a minority of people who are incarcerated or even receiving any sort of mental health care, ineffective and inadequate as it may be. Suicide is the leading cause of death for people in local jails. 43 and 44% of individuals incarcerated in state prisons and local jails, respectively, have a diagnosed mental illness, and over 1 in 4 individuals jailed 3 or more times in a year report having a moderate or serious mental illness. So, all of this to say that people with psychiatric disabilities are far more overrepresented in institutionalized spaces than they are in the community. The demographic stats aren't the only ones we should be looking at. And just a warning, this is going to be talking about some violence. There was a recent article from WITF, which is a subsidiary of NPR and PBS. where a mental health investigative journalist discovered that it was common practice within Pennsylvania county jails to utilize pepper spray and stun guns and other violent means of force against incarcerated individuals experiencing a mental health episode. The investigators reviewed incarceral records which were written by correctional officers. So I just want to make
Mhm.
this clear that this are reports and data from the people who were utilizing the violent means. This is not word of mouth that was somehow diluted or anything. This is coming from the correctional officers. When they reviewed these records, they found that these records provided really candid details as to what led to these uses of force. And it was found that just 10% of these uses of force were used in response to a prisoner assaulting someone or threatening to assault someone. 1 in 10. That was, I mean, whether or not you believe that that is a righteous method to deal with physical threats, that happened 10% of the time.
Mm.
The investigation discovered that it was far more likely that these incidents occurred because a prisoner was either attempting suicide, attempting to hurt themselves, or threatening self harm. So we see very clearly from the records of correctional officers that physical violence is being utilized as a way to manage mental health episodes. While supporters of these techniques claim that they save lives, opponents as well as human rights advocates argue that they are inhumane and ineffective. So we have to ask ourselves, which is the chicken or the egg, right?
Mhm.
Is it that this is the best criminal justice system? Yeah, this is the best tool that we have at our disposal to manage mental health systems. It's the best that we can hope for. Or do jails and prisons actually have an impact on one's mental health? And it turns out study after study, meta study after meta study
Mhm.
shows that incarceration can trigger and even worsen symptoms of mental health. And these symptoms don't just disappear once they re-enter society. While of
Mhm.
course every individual is different, research shows that incarceration is linked to mood disorders, including major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, as well as something called post incarceration syndrome, which is a condition very, very similar to PTSD.
Mm.
Even in the most humane of prisons, which you might find in Nordic regions, many defining features of incarceration are still linked to negative mental health, including disconnection from family, isolation from community, loss of autonomy, boredom and monotony, lack of purpose, and unpredictability of your surroundings. Other factors detrimental to mental health include overcrowding, exposure to various forms of violence, enforced solitude, or conversely, complete lack of privacy, insecurity about future prospects, including work, relationships, as well as inadequate health services, especially mental health services. And unless you have a loved one who is incarcerated, it may be really easy to forget how far away you are from your family, from your community when you're locked up, and the drastic effects that it can have. There was a study that was done in University of Georgia in 2018 that found that people who were incarcerated more than 50 miles from their home were more likely to experience depression. And another study found a high correlation between overcrowding and police suicide. And this says nothing of the effects it has on the incarcerated individual's family and community. So, negative mental health effects can be experienced not just by those who have pre existing mental health conditions and enter the justice system, but it can be experienced by those without a prior history of this. And this is in part due to what we call the psychosocial determinants of health. This is where I kind of nerd out.
Mhm.
This is a big part of my master's degree. The World Health Organization defines the psychosocial determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. Typically, issues that go beyond the scope of traditional Western healthcare. They include factors like socioeconomic status, education, the physical environment you're in, your employment, your social networks, as well as access to healthcare. So, obviously, incarceration is a negative force on all of these dimensions, But for now, let's focus on the environment of incarceration. As you said, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this.
Yes.
But in the environment of incarceration, the constant exposure to boredom and monotony, peppered with unpredictable bouts of violence, along with social isolation, poor healthcare, anticipation of hardship and stigma upon release, as well as zero rehabilitation, will have psychological effects because the human brain did not evolve to be adaptive to long term stresses with no resolution. Sometimes researchers call this allostatic load. Allostatic load refers to the cumulative burden of chronic stress in life events, and it involves the interaction of all different types of physiological systems, various degrees of activation in the body.
Mhm.
We all know about fight or flight response to acute stress, which is mostly good and appropriate because stress hormones in the body in the short term promote adaptation. Uh, this is how human brains evolved, right? Back in
Mhm.
the Sierra, when you were early human days, our major stress was because we were prey to major predators. So we would be in our community, a predator would come out, we'd run away, we'd gather, we'd escape from the short-term stress, the short-term predator, and then we would find meaning. We're like, okay, someone so and so wasn't watching, or we didn't realize that it could do this. We would find meaning, and we would be able to move forward with new insights as a community, and it would then be resolved, right? But that is
Mhm.
not the environment that we live in modernity, and it's not certainly not the environment that we live in when we are incarcerated. So, in the to bring it home, when environmental challenges and stresses exceed our ability to cope, that's when allostatic overload ensues. So, in
Mhm.
other words, short term and manageable stress are adaptive for our brains, but it becomes maladaptive in the long term and there's no reprieve. And there are physical changes, physical damages in the brain that happen when there is no reprieve from constant stress and constant trauma. Neuroscience has been incredibly clear about what is necessary for the brain to thrive, right? We need clean air, clean water, warmth, sleep, physical movement, low stress, healthy diet, and social interactions, right? That's not rocket science. We
Mhm.
know this. Humans evolved to move our bodies and find meaning and belonging via our social interactions. In fact, many believe that the famous ancient Greek tragedies were an unconscious collective way for us to heal from the constant trauma of war.
Hmm.
Again, that is a podcast for another time, but like that is how deep
Yeah.
our social bonding is to healing from stress and trauma. And that's what I really want to bring home. So even if jails and prisons were not inherently violent places, the isolation alone would be enough to cause lasting psychological damage. And to understand how, we have to understand how stress and isolation affects the brain. The brain is, of course, the key organ that deals with stress, particularly the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, which can undergo stress induced structural remodeling when the allostatic load is overwhelming, such
Mm.
as during the conditions of incarceration. This, in turn, alters behavioral and physiological responses, which again obviously affects things like recidivism. So, as an adjunct to pharmaceutical therapy, if that's necessary, social and behavioral interventions such as regular physical activity and social support reduce the chronic stress burden and benefit the brain and body health, as well as benefit our resilience, which are in short supply when you're incarcerated.
There is none of that happening. In
Yeah, none of that is happening,
none of
obviously.
that. Yeah.
Being incarcerated is obviously an incredibly stressful experience. One of the most stressful experience, however, is solitary confinement.
Mhm.
The stress of forced isolation can cause permanent damage to one's brain and therefore our personality. We saw that with Khalif Browder, who
Mhm.
you mentioned, and again, it's a wonderful documentary about him. Living in solitary confinement is a grueling experience that damages the brain after just a few days. A 2000 study found that people were significantly more likely to develop psychiatric disorders while in solitary confinement than if they were housed in non solitary units in prison and jail. In solitary confinement, the individual is housed in a room smaller than the average parking space.
Yikes.
So I want to pause and I want everyone listening to imagine the last time you were in a parking lot. We can all probably bring up an image of how big a parking spot is. When you're forced into solitary confinement, you are stuck in a room smaller than that space. The space is about 5 by 8 feet. There is constant sensory stimulation. The lights are always on and there's always noise. There's high stress, there's disrupted sleep, poor diet, there's no cognitive enrichment. This means that all of the ingredients for a healthy life have been removed. The isolation has long term physical and psychological effects, such as increased morbidity and mortality, increased likelihood of depression, social withdrawal, aggression, obsessive thoughts, decreased distance vision, which means that once you are released from prison, your distance vision has been decreased because your eyes have been so understimulated. You have been in this small space that not only your vision, but your ability to navigate spaces becomes decreased and impaired as well. People experience hallucinations, paranoia, psychosis, and of course the deteriorated ability to concentrate. This obviously is going to worsen any pre-existing mental illnesses you have and probably create ones that weren't there in the first place. And this obviously increases recidivism.
Hmm.
So, if we are telling ourselves that prisons exist to decrease crime and recidivism and to improve public safety, we have to confront the way that actual outcomes are perpetuating and even creating cycles of harm. I'm not going to nerd out for too much longer. I do just want to bring home the physical damage that this does to the brain. This isn't some woo woo Gen X, kid glove hand holding, thing
Hmm.
that young people care about these days. This is science. This is data. This is empirical data that we can see with our eyes. So, isolation and forced confinements affects our brain in four main ways: anatomically, biochemically, with inflammation, and it affects our protective factors. So, our brain's neurons require stimulation resulting from social interaction. So, forced confinement is going to change the size and shape of our dendrites. Dendrites are the part of our neuron where information enters the neuron. A healthy neuron is going to have dendrites with all these different legs, and it's busy and long and really complicated. A damaged neuron from isolation, trauma, and confinement is going to be really stingy, a really weak, maybe one dendrite with a few arms sticking out from it. Again, it's very noticeable.
Hmm.
This deterioration is going to impact neurotropic factors that block neuron death, which is critical to the development, maintenance, and repair of our nervous system. Chronic stress and isolation reduces our brain's capacity to respond to inflammatory challenges, which increases the likelihood of illness, which again is going to increase the physical damage to our bodies. All of this accumulates in decreased neuro and central nervous system repair in our body's natural processes, trauma, and aging. This is not something that is unique to humans. Non human animals exhibit all of these same things too. In fact, even when lab animals are isolated and then brought back to general population, they are more aggressive. Even with siblings, even with the animals that they grew up with and are incredibly familiar with and trust, they are more aggressive. We can see this echoed with human beings who are incarcerated. So, beyond the exacerbation and the formation of major mood disorders, including post incarceration syndrome, exposure to incarceration, especially in the long term, can result in what are called institutionalized personality traits, which include distrusting others, difficulty maintaining relationships, difficulty making good decisions, issues with spatial referencing, and difficulties in social interactions, as well as feelings of social alienation. And when you experience these things, again, these things don't magically disappear. When you leave prison, you bring this out to your community with you, and it has effects on the community that you're sent back in. I want to pause
Yeah.
before I go into Philadelphia as a whole. I just dumped a whole bunch on you. Tell me about what you're thinking. What thoughts have come into your head as I'm reading some of these statistics in this research?
Yeah, I the so one of the biggest things that I'm going to talk about next week with one of our guests is the interaction of the community with people who are returning. And I think it's so important to understand that like their brains are literally changing, like to
Yes.
understand that trauma and like you really have to come from a place of understanding and meet them where they're at and understand to have patience and just know like the challenge that it is for them to come back and try to get back up again, go back into the like we expect people to just be able to just jump back in, not understanding that there is literal like mental like barriers that are stopping them from being able to do that. And like we often talk about in the ghouls, like how when you're in traumatic environments and you're in that flight or flight response, like you go, 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 go. And it's not until you stop and all of that stuff is able to like rush into you that you'd see the effects really clearly. Because the whole time you've just kind of been moving on to the next thing or just trying to survive and get through it. So when you finally stop having to just survive, that's when it all just accumulates and you're like drowning in the entire like all the things that you were just experiencing, and small things start to cause stress where they wouldn't before because
Oh
your
yeah.
system just don't operate the same way. They don't understand anxiety and stress in the same way. And so I think that like I knew about a lot of like the mental aspects of it, not to this degree. Like I'm so thankful for all this information. Like I can hear like Kat geeking out about just like the statistics and having like all these resources and information, being able to point at studies to say this is what it's doing. But it's so clear like when you're interacting with people that you know and love, and having that distance from them is harming the family members as well. Like I know people who have been incarcerated, people close to me, loved ones been incarcerated, and I know the damage it did for us. And I know other people that I've talked to, someone I'm going to talk to next week, she talks about her distance from a family member and how it's been impossible to go see them, and they're in this state. It's just impossible to go see them. It's just not allowed. And so I think it really is so intense and complex. And just like, I really think learning and understanding is really the first step to be able to find the compassion and patience to help those communities who are so severely harmed by these systems.
Absolutely, because when we're talking about mental health, we're not just talking about people with diagnosed, psychiatric disabilities. All of this comes in trauma.
Hmm.
Even if you have a parent who's incarcerated, like that causes trauma. It's an adverse childhood experience. All the studies on the ACE studies, ACE, the ACE studies,
Hmm.
adverse childhood experiences, and we know again this is a unpopular thing sometimes in general population to maybe use a bad metaphor, but we have this idea that bad people commit crimes, right?
Hmm.
And it can't possibly be that hurt people, right? And that two of the main drivers of violent crime is lack of resources and trauma. So if you grow up in a violent household, or if you grow up, as a black man in America, as a trans child in this country, like you are going to be experiencing different levels of trauma, which are going to make it harder for you to make pro-social behavioral choices. That is not that individual's fault. It is the fault of how society treats them. So a lot of this stuff starts in childhood.
Hmm.
If we want to reduce populations in prisons, we need to invest in our children, not just the rich, happy, right white kids. We need to invest in all of our children,
Mhm.
because it's a cycle of trauma. It's a cycle of harm.
Mhm. It's that school to prison pipeline that,
Exactly.
the Wendell Wild was trying to address as well. It's like if you start
Exactly.
there, you know that it's infecting all the way up and that it's just going to keep going. Like you can't, there's no hope for the future because our future is already infected.
Exactly. Exactly. So again, this is what well, this isn't what I did my exact master's thesis on, but I'm going to be drawing on a lot of research that I used from it. And I interviewed correctional staff, I interviewed behavioral staff, I interviewed a lot of leadership at the Philadelphia Department of Prisons. I interviewed social workers, I interviewed people who were incarcerated. Um, and so this is where a lot of these statistics are coming from. They're coming from the people who have lived experiences inside the walls. So, as I said, Philadelphia is the most incarcerated city and the most incarcerated country in the world. We have 7 out of 1,000 citizens behind bars, and approximately three-quarters of the Philadelphia jail population wait 6 months before getting their day in court.
Yeah.
Yes. So again, I could be picked up for a crime because maybe they're looking for someone who is white, feminine presenting, has shoulder length black hair, et cetera. And I maybe don't have money for bail or for anything other than a public defender. It is most likely that I am going to be stuck in jail waiting for my day in court. It
Mm.
means I haven't been found guilty, right? And that what does that mean? It means I've lost my job,
Mhm.
right? It means I've lost connection with my community. How am I supposed to pay for these bills, right?
Mhm.
It really creates a system where you cannot win. And as you said before, it is not designed to do so. And when I surveyed formerly incarcerated folks and people who were incarcerated in the Philadelphia jails, one of the most common things that they said was tied to the critical gaps they weren't getting that was going to lead to successful reentry was mental health. Other factors included housing, employment, substance abuse and recovery, and healthcare access. So you can see all of that is really tightly related.
Mhm.
And according to the people who are leaders at the Philadelphia County Jail, 16% of the folks incarcerated there have, again, a diagnosed, quote unquote, severe mental illness. That is terminology that they use,
Mm.
severe mental illness. So that's 16%. So you could have moderate, undiagnosed, right? There's a
Mhm.
whole bunch of people that are not captured in that 16%. Um, so again, while the results of my study were a little bit tangential to this podcast, it focused on all the health needs, not just psychological. There was some research that I wanted to share. I analyzed the zip codes of people who were incarcerated at the Philadelphia County Jail, and I found that there were 6 zip codes that made up over 1/3 of the population
Mm.
at the jail. And of those 6, 3 encompassed almost over 20%. So it's really, really focused. It's like
Yeah.
criminality, quote unquote, is not evenly distributed across Philadelphia. It is hyper focused on certain populations, right, in certain areas. So you kind of the common thing is, well, those people, right?
Mhm.
There's something that's wrong with those people living in those zip codes. But it turns out if you look at data, which like I am a data person, right?
Mm.
I then compared those zip codes to a map of Philadelphia's medically underserved areas, MUAs. And
Mm.
this was a report put together by the Philadelphia Department of Health. This is not something that I personally put together. The report is publicly available online. Google Philadelphia medically underserved areas for more info. Highly recommended. But this comparison that I did of the zip codes of people who were incarcerated in the county jail and people who live in underserved areas showed that 80% of individuals incarcerated in Philadelphia jails come from medically underserved areas. And this statistic was corroborated by the Philadelphia Department of Prisons. I'm
Mhm.
going to say that again. 80% of people incarcerated in our jails come from medically underserved areas. Now, I don't know about you, Gabe. I don't think that's a coincidence,
Yeah.
right?
At some point, you're like, you know what?
And I know this is mostly focused on like the mental health and psychological effects, but I also want to bring up that almost three quarters of individuals at our Philadelphia jails struggle with substance abuse
Mhm.
issues. About a third are in there for drug charges, but three quarters live with substance abuse issues. And when you live in a medically underserved area, if you have chronic pain, if you have any number of health issues, and you don't have access to healthcare, you are probably going to result to underground methods of dealing with that chronic pain, with
Mhm.
those immediate health needs, because you have to live your life. You have
Mhm.
children, you have bills to pay, right? So
Mhm.
you are going to do whatever you have to do in order to live your life. And so that is something that I think is a huge spit in the eye
Mhm.
to this concept of bad people do bad things. And what's worse is that like Philadelphia as a city is host to some of the best medical suppliers and hospitals in the country, including Penn Medicine and Jefferson. But these assets aren't distributed evenly across the city, which opens up all these questions around incentivization of
Mhm.
who deserves healthcare in this country. The best served zip codes medically in Philadelphia have 10 times as many primary care physicians within a short drive than underserved areas. The same report, commissioned by the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, found that the ratio of patients to primary care providers within a short drive is about 900 to 1 citywide, but in underserved areas, it's almost 3,000 to 1. That is the
Wow.
scope of the discrepancy of inaccess. So it's not, oh, they just have to drive an extra 10 minutes. It is that much of a difference.
Mhm.
900 to 1 in well serviced areas, 3,000 to 1 in underserviced
Mhm.
areas. And what's even more frustrating, Dave, is that the data suggests that the city has enough primary care providers to serve a city with a population of this size. It's a distribution and it's an
Mhm.
equity
Mhm.
issue across the city. So it becomes very apparent very quickly that one's chances of experiencing incarceration and the exacerbation of mental illness drastically goes up just based on the zip code that you were born in. So I have a lot more to say on this, but I'm going to conclude so we can have a conversation. We often think of incarceration as experience with a beginning and an end. However, when we look at the research, we can clearly see that the effects of incarceration on an individual's physical and mental health last long after they've walked through the prison gates and back into society. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that not only do prisons not keep us safe, but that incarceration is not an acceptable experience for, I would say, pretty much anyone, but
Mhm.
particularly in terms of neurological development, resolving traumatic experiences, promoting pro-social behavior, or ensuring one's human rights.
Yeah. Yeah, hearing some of those things, it reminds me of previous episodes we've done, not obviously not on the incarceration system, but just thinking of some of the episodes in which we've covered medical situations. So we covered like organ donation and how
Mm,
it's in specific areas they are less likely to be on the donor list or have access to it because there's a time limit for how long they can keep that organ on ice. So your distance from the hospital to get that organ risks your life even further. And people can just pack up and be able to move closer to this hospital on the chance that they get this organ. And so that also, funnels people into certain areas. But it like that and just I think it's so interesting to see like the comparison, like when you just take a step back and look at these environments and start asking questions of like what isn't being seen here, like what are these people lacking, and I feel like it really is easy to, once you start putting those pieces together, you start looking at it and putting those maps over each other, it is really not hard, it is not hard
Yeah.
to see in the least, like you just have to look, you just have to bother with caring for a minute.
Yeah, and the research is out there, and so you have to wonder if there's incentives to ignore it.
Yeah, yeah, yes, exactly. What which is, is kind of the heart of what we were trying to cover in this is really there's a lot of profit to be had from keeping people in there. And that profit looks different. It could be a financial profit, it could just be a way to keep certain communities oppressed,
Yeah.
and not able to better themselves or make a change because they're trying to just get out of the hole that you keep digging for them. And like, I'm really thankful for the specific like mental health, but also physical facts that you brought into it because one of the things I had originally wanted to cover is I read this book titled um, Savage Appetites by Rachel Monroe, which is more about women's obsession with true crime. And there's four
Mm.
stories. So one is about like this woman who existed at a time where women couldn't be detectives. And so she helped in different ways and she
Oh,
created, yeah,
cool.
it's pretty interesting, and it's definitely coming from the lens of someone who finds the true crime community to be pretty toxic, which I agree. I've definitely talked about it before. I was a former recovering true crime addict. I could speak on those issues, but it's like, and that's not to say that true crime, like armchair sleuths have not done some really amazing things, like Michelle McNamara. Like we would not, be able to lock up certain criminals if it weren't for some of these folks. And there's also the fact that like in the true crime community, we know how sloppy and ill equipped and problematic the police force can be when it comes to crimes and just how often they get things wrong or just ruin evidence or just not take people seriously. So those things I can, understand that there's this whole other fascination with true, like with criminals, that like murderers, that you could really look down on. But there's one particular story and it's about the Paradise Lost folks, one of the boys from that um, case. And it was kind of this exploration because he was incarcerated when he was very young. He was a teenager. And then he
Yeah.
was incarcerated all throughout his adulthood before they were able to release him. And there was this whole discussion about how, like he had his peripheral vision didn't work. He had short-term memory loss. He like had all these different health issues that all of it, like I was reading that and that was my first time actually like sitting there and thinking and being like, that we don't talk about that enough. We do not talk about like, of course, like once you hear it or once you someone tells you about it, you're like, of course that would happen. Like if you're trapped in this box and you only have this much room to interact with, of course your brain is going to stop using all of those pieces of it and it just doesn't need it anymore.
Yep.
Or the aggression too, like all those pieces really fit into it. And I think the biggest thing that we're finding with what you like this thread that I was seeing through like um, incarcerated people with mental illness, severe mental illness, or any substance use. All of those are that we have this villainization of them. There is this just mass understanding or labeling of these specific communities that allows people to continually abuse them and see them as less than. And so then they can get
Homelessness as
away with
well.
it. Yes.
Homelessness as well.
Yeah.
About 30% of people in the Philadelphia County Jail are in a constant state of homelessness. A lot of the behavioral health specialists actually said that if they could wave a magic wand and fix anything, it would be the housing situation because that more than anything was such a predictor of recidivism.
Well, because it's like you need that, and that has such a complex thing to it, right? Like you need a house to get your ID, to get
Yeah.
your VA benefits, to get a job, like, and then to make money. Like, it is this core, like, to have a home, which is a basic necessity that everyone should have, regardless of who you are. Like, every that's just plain out. And so it's such a core piece of what people are missing. And there's also like, next week I talked to two folks about it, but there's also a technological divide for people who were
Oh
incarcerated in
yeah.
the 90s and coming out now. The world is entirely different, and that's a whole new obstacle. And because the world keeps adapting and changing and we take it for granted, that you don't stop and think about what are the challenges, what are the hurdles and the boundaries that they're going to have, that our system is just designed to keep those in place, because we don't deserve, like, people just don't think they deserve any support.
And they're such a profit maker for some people, and I don't know where the money goes. Like, it certainly doesn't go towards services for incarcerated folks.
Mhm.
I mean, the systems that the computer systems that medical staff and behavioral health staff have to use, they're ancient.
Mhm.
And they don't, they're complete, all the departments within incarceration are siloed, right? Correctional does not speak with behavioral, does not speak with medical, does not speak with, everything is siloed, right? And so there is no integration, there is no human experience. You're just, you're cattle pretty much.
Yeah, there's no understanding of the individual. It's like, who is
Correct.
this person? What are they coming in here with? Like, in any aspect, right? Do they have like physical things that we need to be accounting, like considering when we interact with them? Like, you see so many horrific instances of, corrections officers interacting with someone who might have a physical disability or something that is unseen, right? And them interacting with them triggers something, and then we end up losing a life for what?
Yeah.
Because there's no communication.
Yeah, people with disabilities are the number two minority group to be on the receiving end of police brutality. I see articles all the time in Philadelphia of particularly like deaf individuals are often shot and killed by the police because the police aren't trained
Mhm.
in that sort of thing. And you know, I think that there's also the case that witnessing incarceration also has a psychological impact, right? It is also harmful for the correctional staff in the same
Mhm.
sort of way that like white supremacy is harmful for white people. It's bad for our souls.
Mhm.
It's harmful for correctional facilities, the people that are in charge of dehumanizing these individuals. It hurts them as well on some level.
Because they have to take that home, right? So, and you
Exactly.
have to, like, you have to hold on to these ideas and this understanding of these people so that you can live with yourself and so that you can continue
Hmm.
your job. Like, you can't do that and also be like, and that's why it's really hard to argue that you can fix a system from inside, because you have to continue that system in order to keep your sanity. Because, like,
Exactly.
otherwise you are wrong. Otherwise you are harmful as well. You are also a part of this bad system. And it's really hard to reconcile that,
Yeah.
when it's something you have to get up and do every day. So, all that to say, it's incredibly complex. Like, I knew this episode was going to be a struggle, and I'm so thankful that you were here, to be able to unpack it and start the conversation, because there really is, like, we are trying to pick one kind of avenue, which is why we wanted to talk about the mental health aspects of it. But there's just so many different things, and they're really just all piling on to each other. And so, um, yeah, anyone who's listening, I hope this is a good little fire starter for you. I hope it really inspires you to do some research. Like you said, we always, provide our resources so you can look into it yourself. If you're like, whoa, that doesn't sound right, look it up, read it, and then see
Yeah.
how much it sounds right. And then, hopefully that'll inspire you to try to help and change the system. And, if, we welcome, thoughts and feelings about the system. If you know someone who's been incarcerated, if you have, if you have been incarcerated and you want to talk about like issues that you've experienced, or just want to vent on our YouTube, that's also allowed. You know how we work. uh Always, with, the understanding of it being a very, um a
Yeah.
place of love and understanding, right? And yeah, I Is there any last thoughts that you want to say, Pascal?
I think I want to say that the United States' way of doing it is not the only way of doing it. There is one prison in Norway. It's called Halden Prison. It's called the most humane prison in the world. They focus on rehabilitation, not punishment. Where every person who is housed there, they have giant windows in their room. They have privacy. They have locks on their doors. They make their own meals, meaning they have sharp objects, and they
Mm-hmm.
have TVs and they have sports, and they have none of the staff carry any kind of weapons. They're all trained in like social work. There's no cameras in cells. There's no cell those cameras in the hallway or in common rooms. There's workshops and all these things, and they have some of the lowest recidivation rates in all of Europe. So I don't want people to think that, like, well, this is the way it just is.
Mm-hmm.
You kids these days just you're too idealistic, and it's not just the way it is. There's lots of different, like, there's literally art in that museum, in that almost called it a museum, in that prison, right? There's Moroccan tiles and huge story high, mosaics and murals and things like that. And it actually focuses on rehabilitation, pro-social behavior and skill sets, and it has a good outcome.
Yeah, because it's like they want those people back. They want them to come back, and they want them to be able to contribute to society and to feel like they are human. And I think that's like
Yep.
the core issue. I didn't even think about like their surveillance aspect of that, like constantly being surveyed, like that has to do a whole another level of psychological damage of never feeling alone, never feeling like you are with your own thoughts, and unless you're put into solitary confinement, which has its own issue, like all of those. Yeah, I can't.
Yeah, you're both isolated yet have no privacy.
Yes.
It's a maddening experience to have to go through day in and day out. People who haven't experienced it, myself included, really have no idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's so much of there is no privacy. There is no right to your own body and to your own space and understanding of who you are. And it's something that we take for granted. Like there's so much that we discussed today where it's just like, as someone who is out here, I take for granted every day. Um, yeah, definitely look into other systems. If you know something you want to share, please let us know. Further reading, things to watch. If you watch Wendell Wild, what did you think? Any of those things we welcome. You can always shoot us an email at thegoalsnextdoor@gmail.com. We can provide some, resources to get in touch with Pascal if you have questions. And then
If it's been made clear, I love talking about this stuff. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, you will not be bothering me.
yes, yes, please do. Um, that's one of our metrics for success is if we get interaction from people. If it said something to someone, and we can change someone's point of view, or at least
Yeah.
enlighten or inform someone, we really cherish that. And be sure to tune in next week for those special interviews we're closing out the year with. And don't get married. They'll eat your kids. So, okay, bye.
Bye.
How can we create systems that help victims and survivors of crime heal? For years, we've served up only punishment and incarceration as justice, and it's left many crime survivors feeling like their needs weren't met. We know from talking to people in our communities that crime survivors want to feel safe, and they want the people that harmed them held accountable. People want to understand why they were harmed and try to make sense of everything that happened. It's important for people who were harmed and their loved ones to have forums to express themselves and get answers. The current system, however, provides few options. People are either steered toward court or the parole board. A victim impact statement is usually the only avenue of expression given, and the only measure of justice is how many years someone will spend in prison or under court supervision. Instead, what if we took money that would be spent on prisons and created county-wide restorative justice programs that offer a different way to feel justice was done? These initiatives could offer trauma counseling and social services to people who are harmed. They could also provide counseling to the person that caused harm to find out what led them to harm others. After deliberate preparation and with the consent of the crime survivor, these programs could facilitate a meeting between all parties with community members there to support all involved. Through these meetings, crime survivors would be empowered to hold the people who harmed them accountable, giving them an opportunity to express directly and safely how it felt, as well as ask any questions and name their needs. Since we want to help turn things around, it could also provide a place where the person who did the harm could express what they need in their lives to change for the better. In the end, a restorative agreement could be crafted that would include a plan to make things right by the crime survivor, the community, and, just as important, to the person who caused harm themselves. We can have a system of justice that places all involved parties at the center of the solutions and promotes healing. It's time we invest in transforming members of our communities instead of incarcerating them.